Afternoon, friends and comrades. I'm Thomas Murray Dawson with Center for Political Education. I'm joining you from the occupied lands of the Ohlone people in the East Bay of California. As usual, we encourage all our participants on this call located in the Bay Area to pay your Shumi land tax, which you can do by following the link in the chat. As usual, the chat is going to be disabled for these calls, except for us to share information with you. If you have questions you'd like to get answered during the call, please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll try our best to get answers to you during the course of the call. If not, we'll try to include responses in our follow-up email. And in that same bar, you can find a CC button to enable closed captioning, and we're also grateful to have ASL interpreters on hand with us throughout the call. On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome to Palestine Solidarity Announcements. If you're new to PSAs, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, the most recent calls to action, and ways you can join the ongoing solidarity work for Palestine in the Bay Area. If you're returning, thanks for sticking with us. Please share these calls with your comrades, colleagues, and friends. And if you're also new to us, just remember that the recordings are also available on YouTube on CPE's channel. Just going to share my screen again just to review our agenda really quickly. We'll start with a semantics grounding, and Samra will lead us through some recent updates and analysis, and then we'll close out with some announcements. Before we begin, I just want to note that we're now 279 days, or over 9 months, since the start of the Gaza genocide. As Samar will note at the start of his report today, what has frequently been described as a vastly undercounted death toll has been given an utterly shocking quantifiable total by one of the world's oldest peer-reviewed medical journals, The Lancet. Over 186,000 are estimated dead in Gaza, or roughly 8% of Gaza's total population. That impossible number is a stark reminder that in all the arenas of military violence and genocide across the globe, from the Congo to Sudan to Palestine and Haiti, the violence of imperialism perpetrated by our own governments is perhaps truly incomprehensible for those of us who reside in the imperial core, despite our profound obligation to make every effort to grasp what's happening and extend our humanity to the victims of empire. This intended ignorance of the ramifications of American life makes our domestic political fights, especially our current elections, so confounding and so consequential. When it comes to having a strategic assessment, it couldn't be more important for the left to have that strategic assessment of the political economy of the current moment, how the degradation of the economic and political system has given rise to authoritarianism, and of course, how we build a working class led political force that's capable of navigating the innumerable contradictions of this unprecedented moment in human history. And of course, all this to win planetary wide liberation. So, as we march towards November's US elections, we should take note of our comrades across the globe who are also navigating related contradictions between Western hegemony and decolonial politics. In England and France, the far right has suffered important losses in consequential elections that have also seen an emergent left galvanized by solidarity with Palestine, which is playing a pivotal role in shifting the political terrain, even if temporarily. So, a programming note for CPE and all those who follow these PSAs next week. We'll be hosting an event on Thursday, a webinar before our next PSA to talk a little bit about one of those elections, the one that took place in France that saw the left not only claim a significant number of seats in French government, but also saw the right wing lose in surprising fashion. So please join us next Thursday at 11 p.m. 11 a.m. rather, Pacific, 1 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern, to talk about the momentous French election and what lessons might be gleaned for how left forces there pulled together a new popular front in just a matter of weeks to build a winning coalition in France. And I think Annie has dropped the link in the chat. And so with that, we'll get started with our PSA for today, and we'll get started with the semantics grounding with Melissa Fan. Welcome back, Melissa.
Thanks, Thomas. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Let's jump into our somatics grounding. So just beginning by noticing where you are in your body. Acknowledging that you don't have to feel good. That sometimes in the practice of somatics, there's this misconception that somatics is about feeling good, when somatics is really about feeling what is. Feeling what is and knowing that what our soma, what our bodies are experiencing is related to the whole of the world. So just dropping in and noticing for yourself, what is here? What is here for you today? Maybe it's feelings of relief to just settle in and pay attention. Maybe it's feelings of irritation to be asked to pay attention. Maybe it's a sense of numbness, of just like, what is even going on in my body? All of that is okay. Whatever you're experiencing is okay. Just noticing. And from this place of noticing, beginning to place some conscious awareness on your breath. Breathing a little bit deeper if you can, maybe 5% deeper. And seeing as you breathe, if you can notice the sides of your rib cage expanding. And from here, seeing if you can expand your breath and that conscious awareness through both sides of your body, left and right. Maybe it helps to give yourself some gentle rubs or taps. Just beginning to notice the sides of your body, the width of your being. In the practice of politicized somatics, the width of your body, the width of your being is the dimension of community. And so as you're here, just bringing conscious awareness to your sides. See if you can feel who is at your sides right now in this moment. Who are your comrades? Who are your loved ones? Your community? The people who are standing at your sides, looking out in the same direction and saying, yeah, I see what you see. I see what you see, and it's really, really hard. And feeling for these people, knowing that the fight for liberation is not one that we do alone. And seeing if you can just identify one person, one or two people that you can extend a little bit of energy towards. To say, thank you for being my comrade. Thank you for being at my side. And feel just as you are extending toward someone else, that someone is probably extending toward you with gratitude. And this is a practice that you can come back to at any point. At any point when you're feeling overwhelmed or numbed out or in despair. And you need a little bit of hope, a little bit of camaraderie. Yeah, just feeling centering in your width and feeling for who's at your sides. Thanks for practicing with me today.
Melissa, thank you so much for that grounding. Let's bring up Samar. Samar, it's great to have you. Thanks for joining us from sunny Baltimore and if an undisclosed location. Uh, Grateful to have you again. I know you're going to cover a little bit of the Lancet figures and then also just talk about the sort of ongoing military aggression that, I think you have to sort of dig a little deeper these days to find out what's going on in the scope of it. But it's been another rough week by all accounts, and an intensification of military attacks within Gaza. And yeah, not enough of that in the mainstream headlines. So we're really appreciative of the research you've done to sort of bring some of this to the forefront. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Thomas. It's great to be here. I can disclose my undisclosed location, which is just a conference center in downtown Baltimore for the Netroots conference. It is good to be here. There are some reflections that maybe I'll share in a future PSA, but let me just take a moment to share my screen. Sorry. All right, just jumping right in. Another really rough week in Gaza. The official death toll ticked up by about 500 or so. That's a lot in terms of the changes we've been seeing in the official death toll lately. So I think it speaks to, and we'll get into this, some of the violence that continues to be happening across the entire Gaza Strip. But the big death toll story, of course, that's come out this week is the article in the Lancet. It is linked to in the slide, so I would recommend giving it a look. They have a very, it's a medical journal, so it can be a little bit dense, but they do have a really accessible summary at the top. And as Thomas noted, the big finding from this extremely well-researched article is that a more accurate attributable death count to the conflict in Gaza at the moment is 186,000 or more, right? That's the sort of the floor-ish of what they've set. But there has been a lot of I think confusion around this figure, and just to be clear, where it's coming from is applying what's commonly understood to be an indirect death multiplier. So the idea that the people who die in a conflict are not just the ones who are shot or bombed, but also folks who end up starving or lacking medical support, or otherwise lacking the infrastructure they need to sustain life. And using that multiplier is where they got to the 186,000 figure. And that figure isn't meant to say that many people have already died. we don't know how many people have already died, right? It's an impossible thing to really accurately describe because again, the official figure is missing a lot of people. As I understand it, that 186,000 is in a way something that's almost worse, which is where we are right now, the number of people who will die as a result of what has already happened. So like, there's that effectively nothing can be done to prevent the death toll from going from whatever it is right now, which conservatively would be around 50,000, to get to reaching 10% of Gaza's population, and that's assuming the actual war ends today, which it doesn't. So, a really horrifying thing, I think, to sit with and to wrap your head around. A reason that Western media outlets have been pretty quiet about this, and that it's not getting the attention it deserves because there's just no way to grapple with a death count this horrifically high. Getting into the actual violence leading into these deaths, we talked last week about how it's hard to focus in on just one region of Gaza anymore, where the fighting now really spans the entire strip, north to south. And that really is a pattern that's continuing. We're not seeing a meaningful change in that this week, nor do I think we will soon. So in the same way that we did last week, just working our way south to north. Rafah now, has 2 months since the offensive. The IDF offensive into Rafah still hasn't taken over the full area of Gaza City, although the unit tracker, which I've historically been using, you've seen some of their maps and things in my presentations, has been pulled off of Twitter. So unfortunately, that information source is lost. I will try to find a replacement, but it's now less clear how much of Rafah the city has been taken. But regardless, we're 2 months in, and what was supposed to be like a quick operation to root out Hamas once again, obviously, very little has been tangibly accomplished by the IDF in this circumstance. Given that the fighting in Rafah is still quite heated and quite ongoing, the IDF is trying to point to some, accomplishments, some victories that it can claim. It's identified some tunnels. It's obviously killed a lot of people. And they're really struggling to do that. So, I wanted to take a minute to reflect on this PR push by the IDF in Rafah, where they invited a bunch of journalists to showcase what they've found and what they've done, and how like even CBS News, not exactly a radical media outlet, described the press tour that it went on in Rafah and how horrific it was, right? Like this is an article that really is not very friendly to the Israeli narrative whatsoever. It just talks about the idea that the entire area has been completely obliterated. And like, talks about the disconnect between the Israeli military objectives and what is actually happening. And, how is the Israeli military says that they're stretched too thin, they're running out of ammunition, and that it's time for a ceasefire, a thing that, Netanyahu himself like is trying to push back on. So really not great. And, the article closes with reports of Hamas fighters moving around in Rafah. So like the idea that, that this has been successful, obviously, is just being undermined at every level. In addition to the IDF being stuck in Rafah, the fighting in Khan Yunis, which has been going on for a while now, is also accelerating. There has been a few really shocking bombings, including another set of bombings of shelters and schools, including one on a shelter that killed at least 8 children and many other people. And you can see here in the article subtitle that the attack that killed 31 people was done using precision munitions. And it, probably won't be a surprise for people to hear that those precision munitions are US made. These are US bombs that we're continuing to send. These are this was the same like small scale, what the Israeli military and the US government are calling small scale munitions that caused that fire in the refugee camp that killed so many people. Like these same things keep happening because these precision guided missiles are gigantic, and the collateral damage that they cause is really quite high. And it's either these missiles or something that they use with them that are often loaded with shrapnel inside them. So the goal here is actually large scale, like human death. So it's not particularly surprising. In the context of this, literally, I think the same day that the story came out, or maybe a day later, the Biden administration has decided to lift one of the very few weapon shipments holds that it has implemented. When Israel started its assault on Rafah 2 months ago, the Biden administration stopped shipments basically of bombs that were 500 pounds and up. And now they've reversed that decision on the 500-pound bombs while maintaining it on the 2,000-pound bombs. This is something that Biden referenced in his real sight to behold press conference yesterday. And so now those 500-pound bombs are once again being delivered to Israel, which, like, if the argument being that the 2,000-pound bombs cause too much collateral damage, but like a 500-pound bomb is obviously also going to cause a lot of collateral damage. Nevertheless, this is where we are, and this is something, somewhat unsurprising given the pressure that's been put on the administration around these issues. We talked about this a few weeks ago, where Netanyahu blasted Biden publicly for stopping weapon shipments, and like the Biden administration was actually hurt by that, right? Enough that they felt like they had to respond and increase weapon shipments in a moment where popular pressure is obviously going very strongly in the other direction. And now going all the way to the north, the fighting in Gaza City has gotten so bad that Israel is now calling for an evacuation of the entire city. So the fighting there is intensifying as opposed to de-escalating, which is something that I think is a bit surprising for a lot of people to see, not because the military capability of Hamas has like been degraded. We know that it hasn't really, but the sort of existing military MO has been to like fight and retreat, right? To not like when the Israeli military moves in, it's not uncommon for Hamas to do a series of quick strikes and withdraw. But the fact that they're holding and maintaining ground is a sign of like it's something of a new phase in the way that the military operations are going. So like the Israeli military seems to be unable to even do the basic thing that it was doing, which is the US Afghanistan approach, right? Which is just roll into an area, contain it. And then when they leave that area, the people that they were fighting come back. But now they can't even do that. So across the board, things in Gaza are looking a little bit funky, and like this evacuation itself is going to be a massive logistical nightmare. The forensic architecture, which often does these incredible, really well-researched articles on the impacts of the Israeli genocide in Gaza, went through a whole thing about how the evacuation orders are like contradicting themselves, how they're sending people into areas that they're also bombing and then moving them into areas that like either don't exist or are not in fact safe zones. It's the age-old question of like evil or stupid, like are they doing that on purpose to issue contradictory evacuation orders because they, like the goal here is Palestinian extermination? Very possible. Also very possible that they've just lost enough like understanding of what's happening on the ground that they're incapable of issuing effective orders at this point. Another like small tragic aspect of this is that the last remaining Doctors Without Borders facility in Gaza has closed as a result of this last batch of evacuation orders. As of the 8th of July, that last facility has now been shut down, and MSF is still hoping to return to that facility, but it's not clear whether or not they'll be able to do that. So the sort of systemic collapse of health infrastructure in Gaza and medical support in Gaza is a thing that we're just, is ongoing. In the context of that, the ceasefire, our age-old topic. I wanted to do something slightly different this week and just talk about the same development through the lens of 3 different media outlets, just to sort of explore the way that a single story can be refracted in many different ways. So at its core, last week we discussed how Hamas had, offered some changes, or has been reported to have offered some changes. It's also possible that those changes are cosmetic, about the way that first cessation of hostilities phase is implemented, and the transition from that phase into the full end of the fighting. We still don't know what those changes were. But this week, Netanyahu put out a series of non-negotiables saying that any attempt to permanently stop the fighting would be unacceptable. And so I just wanted to cover the way that 3 different outlets released this news. The first, the New York Times, the liberal standard bearer, described it as a Hamas sticking point, right? The article opens by saying Hamas has softened its position in its latest Gaza ceasefire proposal, but is sticking to a key demand that has been a major hurdle to a deal. You have to get 4 paragraphs down until you get to what that key demand is, which is Hamas wants to ensure that it does not turn over many of the hostages only for Israel to restart the war. In other words, Hamas wants the ceasefire to be a ceasefire and not a truce. Compare that to the Times of Israel, which among Israeli media outlets is a fairly right-wing one, which describes it as Netanyahu releasing a list of non-negotiable demands as hostage talks were slated to restart. And the opening paragraph here describes it as Netanyahu introducing a guarantee that Israel could resume fighting, which would need to be met before any like hostage release or ceasefire deal with Hamas could be signed. Immediately after that, it's described as something that has been received as an attempt to sabotage the progress in negotiations, both within Israel and among the mediators. So like, okay, like actually a description of what's happening and what people on the ground are saying. And then a third article in The Guardian, which itself, I would say, has historically some pretty problematic Palestine coverage. At least what's happening here is just right in the headline, right? Israeli government accused of trying to sabotage Gaza ceasefire proposal, which is clearly what this is. So, and really importantly, the way that this Guardian article opens is the Israeli government has been accused of attempting to sabotage a US-backed ceasefire proposal. Remember, this is the proposal that Biden had pushed. It's the same one, according to Israeli media, by introducing new demands despite previously accepting the plan, right? Like that context, I think, is so important here, that this is the same proposal that the US has not only said that they agree with, but has loudly and publicly said the Israelis have also accepted this proposal. And now Israel is officially backtracking on that in a way that, a not insignificant chunk of the Western media refuses to call out openly. So what that means for the ceasefire actually going through, it's a little bit hard to say, you know. I think it's clear that Hamas is trying to get this through, and that the current proposal as it exists is acceptable to the US, to Hamas, and to segments of the Israeli political class. You know, like there are divisions within Israel. And it seems that the sort of military establishment, you know, which before Israel's like turn to even further right in the past few years, used to be the sort of governing consensus of Israel. That faction seems to be okay with it. And so whether they'll be able to enforce that decision above Netanyahu's objections, hard to say, very hard to say. In a promising sign, the sort of standard bearer of that, well, the two standard bearers of that movement, one is Yoav Gallant, who is the sort of like US, you know, preferred interlocutor, has also spoken really favorably about this deal, as has this very high-ranking general that historically Netanyahu had blocked from attending the ceasefire negotiations, has now joined them officially. So people are taking that as a sign that the ceasefire deal might be imminent. I'm feeling a little less optimistic, but again, it's really hard to say who's going to win out. It, you know, in the mix of all of this is the idea that the Israeli public itself has shifted very strongly in favor of a ceasefire. You know, critically, not because the Israeli public disapproves of Israel's handling of the war. On the contrary, approval ratings of the war continue to be extremely high in Israel, but just because they're not seeing any sort of result from it, and they want the hostages back, and they want the war to end so that things can sort of, you know, quote unquote, return to normal. So, you know, we're seeing in recent polling, when asked whether people should continue the war or bring hostages home, over 2/3 are saying bring the hostages home. So there is internal domestic pressure within Israel for that ceasefire to go through. But I think critically, Netanyahu's political base is probably mostly in that 26% camp that would rather continue the war. You know, and this is like the settler base and the hard right. Including, by the way, the Orthodox community, that the ultra-Orthodox community that not only broadly supports the war, but also doesn't have to fight in it because they're exempt from the draft. Although new court rulings have changed that, and whether that changes their support for the war is something we'll see, I think, in the coming months as they face the possibility of actually being drafted into the fighting. That internal tension in Israel is something that feels like it's growing. It's hard to say, you know, what that breaking point of that is going to be, or how deep these internal contradictions can go before they actually cause material harm to the kind of underlying state structure. But I did want to note a couple of things that came out in the past week. One, an article describing the kind of like hard fascist turn within Israel and the way that it's dividing, you know, the internal Israeli electorate, the ways that like a big segment of the Israeli left is now getting behind Naftali Bennett, who was like a former prime minister who was to the right of Netanyahu. So like the idea that the Israeli left is now like openly embracing fascism is a really fascinating development there that I think is causing a lot of turmoil. And within that political turmoil is also some pretty serious economic turmoil, where a recent article in Mariv, an Israeli newspaper, described what they called a country in collapse because 50,000 businesses have closed as a result of the war. A lot of this, somewhat ironically, is either the construction industry or things related to the construction industry, because historically that industry has relied on cheap, exploited Palestinian labor. And now that that labor is no longer accessible to them, those industries are starting to fall apart. And then tourism, obviously, taking a pretty massive hit. This is a Google translated article. So if you click the link, it's going to be in Hebrew, and that's why it looks like a little funkily formatted here. So my apologies, but I think it's important to note that the Israeli economy is struggling, right? It has yet to recover from like the economic shocks from October onward. A lot of people like to point out that the Israeli economy dropped by 20% in the last quarter of last year, and it did, but it also rebounded in the beginning of this year something like 16%. So we shouldn't overstate the damage that's happening to the Israeli economy. One thing that is a sort of staple of colonial war is that people sort of continue to live as if the unimaginable violence that's happening 6 kilometers away like doesn't really affect them, and that's something we absolutely continue to see in like Tel Aviv and Haifa or wherever. But the economy is also like not growing, and it's significantly hemorrhaging both people and money. So how that both impacts Israel's ability to wage this war and its prospects for waging the war in Lebanon, I think are things we just need to sort of keep in mind. The other piece of this, I think we spend a lot of time talking about and trying to understand is the Israeli state's motivations and intentions. I think it's also really valuable to try to think about and understand Hamas's motivations and intentions. And so I would point folks to, Jeremy Scahill and Ryan Grimm, the 2 reporters from The Intercept, have started a new news site called Dropsite. And an early article is an interview with some senior Hamas officials. And I think it's a really valuable grounding in what their underlying motivations are and what their expectations are from this moment to better understand how things move forward. If folks don't want to read the article, it's kind of long. There's also a really good interview on Democracy Now! About it that folks can check out. But at its core, basically, and I think the main takeaway from me reading that article was Hamas leaders that are interviewed by Jeremy Scahill talk about how they had attempted to find all of these different non-violent approaches over the past 5 years, and they talk about their engagement in the like the Great March of Return, this like giant non-violent protest movement that resulted in hundreds of Palestinians being killed, and have come to the conclusion that for them, violent resistance is the only thing that moves the needle. So like given that understanding, it's hard to imagine them agreeing to a situation where they will give up the sort of military engagement that's happening right now in return for a temporary truce, right? It's just like not going to happen. So given that, the idea that one of Netanyahu's non-negotiables is that Israel reserves the right to continue fighting in Gaza, and Hamas is basically anathema. Like Hamas is deeply opposed, like constitutionally opposed to the idea of letting Israel continue to do that. Like one side or the other's got to give. That's not a sustainable position for a ceasefire negotiation to take place. So which way it'll go, I mean, I think there is hope to be had in the idea that the like military side of the Israeli political class sees the importance of a ceasefire now. So the hope is that is the thing that gets pushed through. But I think, it's a thing that we'll see more in the coming days. A quick look at Lebanon. There isn't much to report on other than the sort of escalatory violence continues to cycle. Israel continues to assassinate high-level Hezbollah officials. But the one maybe new development that I wanted to spend just a minute on was this New York Times expose about the Biden administration official that has been managing the negotiations on the border, who is Amos Hochstein. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, who was a previous envoy to Saudi Arabia, famous for apparently convincing the Biden administration that it was okay that Saudi Arabia murdered that journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, back in 2018, and is himself a former lobbyist and an exec at a natural gas firm, which the New York Times is like, okay, yeah, he's a natural gas firm executive, or was, but it's okay because he has an all-electric Ford Mustang with rooftop solar panels. Okay. And this person is not a trained foreign service officer. He's just like a buddy of Biden's, who is managing the negotiations between Israel and Hezbollah on that border. So that doesn't give me a lot of hope. And that, he does not appear to be like a person who's unbiased on how this should develop, unsurprisingly. So it's a really interesting article. I would definitely recommend giving it a read. Meanwhile, on the international stage, the International Court of Justice should be issuing its opinion on the West Bank, like the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, including Jerusalem, a week from today. So this is a separate case. It's not the genocide case. It's a different case. And so this case was asking the court to issue an advisory opinion on the illegal occupation of the West Bank. And so that's coming out this Friday, an important moment, as we've talked about Israel's attempts to formalize the annexation of the West Bank. There's also a nice article in here from a South African judge, who I don't think is the ICJ judge, despite what this Le Monde title says, who talks about both the limitations and the importance of things like these ICJ rulings, acknowledging that they're not changing the facts on the ground and that, we can't realistically expect them to, but the role that they still have to play in reframing the kind of, both the narrative and setting things on a particular sort of historical trajectory. So I thought that was worth looking at. The other big thing to come out this past week was a Haaretz investigation on the IDF's use of the Hannibal Directive, this idea that the Israeli military shouldn't let Israelis get taken captive, and that if there's ever a situation where they think that an Israeli is going to be taken hostage, that the military can use whatever force possible to, quote, prevent soldiers being taken into captivity, meaning kill them and anyone who's trying to take them. Basically, despite the fact that a lot of people who have been saying that the Hannibal Directive was used on October 7th, those people have been attacked for saying that, Haaretz has now conducted an investigation, interviewed a bunch of Israeli soldiers, and has shown pretty definitively that it was in fact used pretty heavily. And that, an unknown number of casualties on that day were a result of Israeli shelling and helicopter rocket fire on positions where they thought that hostages were being held. So, and that investigation, again, run by an Israeli newspaper, totally absent in the Western press. Like, I haven't seen a single story about it. But in like the, traditional mainstream press, obviously. There's more that's been coming out on the IDF rules of engagement. I don't think we need to get too much into this article, but again, a thing for you to read if you feel so inclined. Just the absence of written rules of engagement, like as a policy, the IDF actually doesn't release rules of engagement, and as a result of that, there's a sort of free-for-all culture where IDF soldiers basically do whatever they want. Unsurprising given what we've seen. And it's good that it's sort of being like documented in this way now. Wanted to touch for a moment on the French elections, maybe also a plug to attend that CPE event this coming week. I think it'll be absolutely fascinating. And just to show the difference that an organized left can make in changing popular discourse, right? This is a country where Palestine protests were banned after October 7th. It's pretty bad in the United States, but at least you can still technically legally protest for Palestine. In France, Macron made it illegal. And the way that Palestine became a really front and center issue there that mobilized voters to back a reinvigorated left. And one of the pictures I have here is Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the one of the titular heads of this new leftist Popular Front, in his victory speech, identifies three things. One is that the left should have the prime ministership. The second is that that prime ministership should have the ability to make decisions directly, even though the parliament is going to be hung, and we have to recognize the state of Palestine. Like, that's the top three things that he had to say. It's like that gives you a sense of the centrality of the issue, even in an election like that, where the other, like the center, basically tried to avoid talking about it at all. And on the other side, we had the Israelis actively campaigning for the far right in a way that even Macron publicly called out, that the Israeli cabinet had been publicly supporting Marine Le Pen for the vote. So just to give you a sense of the scope and the importance of the way that these elections play out. Meanwhile, locally, in some very good news, the city of Alameda has fully divested from weapons, right? And fossil fuels. This is like a long running thing, but now have explicitly stated that our cities shouldn't be invested in the Israeli occupation or war crimes anywhere, or in the military industrial complex, but rather in the well-being of our communities here. Really powerful and beautiful to see, and like a BDS win that has material impact, right? It's something that I think we want to see replicated across other cities, and stay tuned for efforts to do that. So quick summation, the fighting in Gaza is ongoing in a way that I think even the Israeli military is surprised by its inability to contain, its West Bankification campaign that we've been talking about. Like the failure of even that, I think, has been a really remarkable thing to see. The ceasefire proposal seems to be inching forward, but Netanyahu is very explicitly trying to block it. Is it possible that forces work around him? Maybe. U.S. weapons shipments continues to be a flashpoint. I think a thing that's becoming increasingly untenable, but Biden, truly a master at doing what is completely absurd and politically untenable at this point, continues to push those weapons through. The contradictions within Israeli society are becoming deeper than I think the structures of that society can contain. Still can't tell you what's happening in Lebanon. War feels imminent, but nothing seems to have changed in the underlying calculus there right now. And just that, there are lessons here, both in France and the UK, for us in terms of how we build a movement that centers Palestine, that can actually build political power. So I lastly just want to identify a couple of upcoming actions for you to consider attending. Cancel RIMPAC is something that, this Pacific Rim military exercise is this gigantic exercise of US military imperialism in the Pacific. They gather hundreds of warships and then do these simulated military exercises. Again, as we build a movement, we want to call out US militarism and imperialism everywhere, not just in Palestine. So this is a good way to sow solidarity for our colleagues that are feeling the brunt of that in the Pacific. And the Middle East Children Alliance is having its 3rd annual bike ride for Palestine, not this Sunday, but the following Sunday. I'm sure I'll talk about that more next week, but I would highly encourage you to attend or sponsor or ride. And then, of course, Netanyahu's coming. It's getting real close. July 24th, he'll be in DC. Would encourage you to go if you can, or activate folks who are in the area that can go. And just to note, Netanyahu was originally going to stop in Europe on his way to the US, and now he can't because he's worried about getting arrested. So he has to fly direct. So just to say, this person who would be arrested if he like hit the ground in Europe is still coming to speak in front of Congress. So I think it's really important that he gets the welcome he deserves. And my final usual call outs, please get involved in anything by checking out the AROC calendar. If you want text updates, just text PSA to 833-633-0604. And check out the Palestine Media Tracker if you want information on the stories that inform these updates each week. And I think that'll close it. Thank you all so much.
Samra, thanks for that update. Just a couple of things I wanted to note that also you may have alluded to this or at least said it, but with RIMPAC, it should be noted that the IDF, Israel, is involved directly in those trainings. So if we think about, folks who are working around Stop Urban Shield here, thinking about, the myriad other circumstances which we've alluded to on these PSAs in which Israel is exporting its brand of um, military training and repression. RIMPAC is a great way to sort of do linked solidarity work. And also, I would make an extra plug for that Jeremy Scahill article that you mentioned. Really fascinating stuff about, sort of Hamas's the lack of the fact that they didn't actually foresee the offensive being as effective as it was, so that they didn't anticipate the Gaza division falling so quickly, and also some of their own perspectives on how this was sort of ginned up afterwards, from their perspective in terms of whether or not civilian deaths were part of the calculus for Hamas at the outset or not. I think it's all information that's worth taking and analyzing. And I think you make a great point that, given how little is out there, it's one of the few instances in which we actually hear, verbatim quotes and get some insight there. So appreciate that link. And yeah, and I'm going to make, one more plug for, I would definitely plug the bike ride. I might join you on that, Sammer, if you're doing it. And then, I'm going to just, of course, I'm going to plug the CPE event one more time. Really encourage folks to join. We'd love to have folks there to ask questions and engage with Clement. Clement is a scholar and a writer who has a book out on Haymarket called Occupation Organizer, which is a critical study of organizing on the left here in the U.S., which is also worth taking a look at. So that is all for today. We'll be back next Friday, and again, we'll have a CPE. We'll have a separate event on Thursday. Before somebody asked in the chat whether it will also be recorded. It will also be recorded, and it will also be available on our YouTube channel if you want to catch it afterwards. Until then, please stay engaged. Please roll out for these events. And to Samra's point, everything we do in terms of continuing the pressure has significant consequence. The fact that we're talking about Netanyahu, having to change his plans because he's afraid of being arrested is a testament to the kind of organizing and pressure that everybody has been engaged in over the last several months. And there's more to do, but it's still noteworthy. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you in about a week's time. Take care.